I never imagined that a peaceful camping trip would turn into a living nightmare until the night I was stalked. I still remember that crisp autumn night in Pine Hollow. Our group had gathered for what we thought would be a relaxing weekend in the remote forest, a place renowned for its rugged beauty and whispered warnings of human malice. While my friends drifted into sleep, I lay awake, haunted by the sound of deliberate footsteps crunching on the dry leaves outside my tent. At first, I tried to dismiss it as a trick of my imagination, but the sound grew louder, more intentional. Unable to ignore the growing unease, I quietly unzipped my tent and stepped into the inky darkness. The beam of my flashlight trembled as it scanned the familiar surroundings until I caught sight of him. A rugged figure, lurking behind a line of trees, his worn clothing blending with the night. His eyes met mine for a split second, burning with a dangerous intensity, and then he vanished into the shadows. I felt my heart pound in my chest as I realized that this was no random encounter. I was being watched. I began to move cautiously, each step measured as I tried to determine his intentions. But soon, I realized he was following. The sound of his footsteps echoed my own, matching my pace, growing ever closer. I fumbled with my flashlight, desperate for any sign of him. In that fraught moment, I saw him again. Only this time, he emerged from behind a thick clump of trees, barely a few feet away. His presence was overwhelming, a silent threat that sent chills down my spine. Panic surged through me. I bolted into the dark forest, my breath ragged and my mind racing. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me feel as though he was right behind me. I ran blindly through the labyrinth of trees until I stumbled upon a small clearing where my friends were still asleep. Trembling, I roused them and explained what I had experienced. Their faces turned from sleep to horror as I recounted every detail: the sound of his footsteps, the chilling gaze, and the relentless pursuit that left me frozen in terror. We decided to pack up at first light, our departure from Pine Hollow hasty and heavy with dread. Later, while researching local history, I discovered old newspaper clippings and testimonies describing a troubled woodsman with a violent past, known to stalk and terrorize those who ventured too deep into the forest. That night, the reality of his presence hit me with crushing force. The true horror in those woods was not some supernatural specter, but a very real, very dangerous man driven by his own demons. Even now, the memory of that night remains vivid, a reminder that sometimes the greatest threat in the wilderness comes not from an otherworldly force, but from the darkness within the human soul. I often wonder if the woodsman still lurks in Pine Hollow, waiting for his next victim.
I thought that summer night would be nothing more than a carefree escape under the stars, until a blood-curdling scream shattered our peace and plunged us into a nightmare. That summer, my friends and I went camping at an old, abandoned campsite deep in the woods. We were excited for a fun weekend, laughing around the campfire, sharing stories and enjoying the clear night sky. The campsite, once lively many years ago, now stood quiet and empty. We set up our tents and tried to relax, enjoying the simple pleasure of being away from the city. Everything seemed normal until, in the middle of the night, I was startled awake by a piercing scream. My heart raced as I jumped out of my tent. In the pitch darkness, I heard frantic voices and the sound of hurried footsteps. I quickly realized that Sarah, one of my closest friends, was missing. I shouted her name, but all I received was an echo in the silent woods. Without wasting any time, I grabbed my flashlight and started searching the area. I ran from tent to tent, but there was no sign of Sarah. As I moved closer to the edge of the camp, I found a torn piece of fabric near her sleeping bag and a set of large, uneven footprints that did not match any of ours. My pulse thumped in my ears as I decided to follow the footprints, hoping they would lead me to her. I moved carefully along a narrow path in the woods, keeping my eyes fixed on the ground and my flashlight steady. Every step felt heavy, and my mind raced with worry. Soon I reached a spot where the footprints grew deeper and more distinct. It was there that I saw a shadow move quickly behind a row of trees. I stopped in my tracks. In that brief moment, I saw a man standing there. His eyes, reflecting in the beam of my light, were cold and unyielding. I knew immediately that he was not just a random wanderer. I felt a surge of fear when I realized that this man must be connected to Sarah's disappearance. He did not speak a word. His presence alone was enough to make me shiver. I heard a low, mocking laugh coming from somewhere behind him. The sound made my blood run cold. I decided then that I had to get back to the campsite and warn everyone, even though every part of me wanted to follow him to find answers. I ran as fast as I could back to the camp, my mind filled with thoughts of Sarah and the mysterious man. When I arrived, my friends were already awake and visibly scared. I explained everything, the scream, the footprints, and the man with the cold, angry eyes. We all felt a deep terror, knowing that a dangerous person was lurking in the woods, targeting unsuspecting campers. We quickly gathered our belongings and called the local authorities, but the night felt endless as we waited for help. Later, I learned from a neighbour that similar incidents had happened before in that area. There were reports of a local criminal who had targeted campers for years. It became clear that Sarah's disappearance was not a random accident, but part of a pattern of cruelty. That night changed everything for me. The fear I felt was raw and real, a reminder that sometimes the worst nightmares come not from ghosts or monsters, but from human beings. I still wonder about Sarah and whether that dangerous man is still roaming those dark woods. Every time I think back to that summer night, I am filled with the memory of that blood-curdling scream, the trail of clues, and the terror in my own heart. Even now, whenever I venture near a campsite, I remember that night and the knowledge that true human terror can lurk in the most unexpected places.
I never imagined that a quiet hike in the woods would turn into a deadly encounter with a secretive group. It was a clear autumn morning when my friends and I set out for a day hike in a remote part of the forest. We planned to enjoy nature, take photos, and share a few laughs along the way. The trail was familiar, and we felt safe among the tall trees and winding paths. But as we ventured deeper, our relaxed mood quickly turned to unease. While following a lesser-known trail, I noticed a clearing up ahead where a group of people had gathered. At first, I thought they were fellow hikers or a small local gathering. However, as we approached, I saw that they were all dressed in matching dark hooded robes, standing in a tight circle and whispering in low, rhythmic chants. The sound was eerie and unlike anything I had heard before. I exchanged uneasy glances with my friends, and we decided to observe from a distance. We tried to move away quietly, but before we could retreat, one of the robed figures turned and spotted us. In that split second, the atmosphere shifted. Shouts erupted from the group, and the chanting stopped abruptly. I felt my heart pound in my ears as several of them began moving quickly toward our direction. Panic surged through me, and I knew we were in serious danger. I bolted from our group and had my legs carrying me as fast as they could through the thick forest. The sound of angry voices and hurried footsteps echoed behind me. I could hear my friends calling out, but the chaos left little time to regroup. I dove behind a large tree, trying to catch my breath and listen. From my hiding spot, I heard the cult members shouting words I couldn't understand, a mix of anger and ritualistic commands. Their tone was harsh and filled with menace. I waited in silence for what felt like an eternity before I dared to peek out again. The forest was dark and twisted, and the voices had grown fainter, suggesting that they might have moved on or were still searching. With a shaky hand, I pulled out my phone and attempted to text one of my friends, but there was no signal. I realized then that I had to rely on my instincts to get away. I crept slowly back to the trail, hoping to find a safe route out of the area. Every snap of a twig underfoot sent a jolt of fear through me, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting the robed figures to reappear. After several tense minutes, I managed to make it back to a spot where I knew the main trail ran. There, I eventually found one of my friends who had also managed to hide until the danger subsided. We regrouped, our faces pale and eyes wide with fear. In hurried whispers, we shared what had happened. It turned out that each of us had a similar story. Brief sightings of the cult members, the sudden change from calm to chaos, and the terror of being hunted by people with cold, determined eyes. We knew, We had narrowly escaped a violent ambush. Later, after we returned home and contacted the local authorities, I learned that there had been similar reports in that area. Locals had mentioned secretive gatherings by a dangerous group known for their extremist rituals and willingness to use violence to protect their secrets. The experience left me shaken and with a deep sense of vulnerability. Even now, when I think back to that day, I remember the chilling silence of the forest, the sudden burst of aggression, and the terrifying sight of those robed figures. I often wonder if they are still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting hiker to cross their path.
I never imagined that a peaceful hike would turn into a life or death struggle. It was a clear, quiet morning when I set out alone for a hike in Silverwood Forest. I needed some time away from the busy world, just to enjoy nature and clear my mind. The trail was empty and I felt safe as I walked among the towering trees. But as I ventured further into the remote part of the woods, everything changed. I was following a narrow and winding path when I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. At first I thought it was just another hiker, but the sound grew closer and more deliberate. Before I could react, a strong hand grabbed my shoulder and I was forced off the trail. In a flash of panic and pain, I lost consciousness. When I came to, I found myself in a dim, musty room. I was sitting on a rickety wooden chair in what looked like an old cabin deep in the forest. My hands were tied with rough rope and my heart pounded as I realized I had been kidnapped. The room was small, with broken windows that barely let in any light. I could hear the wind howling outside, and every creak of the old floorboards made me shiver. The man who had captured me was not here at that moment, but I could sense his presence in the silence. I could imagine his angry face and the cold glint in his eyes from the brief glimpse I had before I lost consciousness. I knew then that he had been watching me for a while and decided to make an example out of me. The terror of being completely alone, with no one to hear my cries, made my stomach churn. I knew I had to act quickly if I wanted to survive. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade away into the night. Then, with trembling hands, I began to work on the ropes binding my wrists. I looked around the small cabin and spotted a loose wooden plank near the chair. Using it, I managed to rub at the knots, slowly loosening them. Every minute felt like an hour as I fought against the ropes in my own fear. Finally, after what seemed like endless struggle, my hands were free. I moved as quietly as I could toward the door. I pressed my ear against the cold wood and listened. The silence told me he was still away, and I took a deep breath, gathering all my courage. I opened the door and stepped out into the dark, dense forest. The night was thick with shadows, and I could barely see the path ahead. I ran through the underbrush, my heart racing with every step. The sound of my own footsteps, mingled with distant echoes, kept me moving faster. I knew that if he returned, I might not have another chance to escape. I pushed myself to run harder, my legs aching and my lungs burning. After what felt like hours in the dark woods, I finally stumbled upon a small dirt road. The faint glow of streetlights in the distance gave me hope. I flagged down a car and, with my voice shaking, told the driver everything. They quickly took me to the nearest police station, where I was able to give my statement. In the days that followed, I learned that the man who had kidnapped me was known to target lone hikers in this area. News reports mentioned similar incidents, but I had never imagined that I would become one of his victims. The experience left me deeply shaken and taught me a hard lesson about the dangers that can hide in even the most peaceful places. Even now, when I see a forest trail or hear a rustle in the woods, I feel a chill run down my spine. The memory of that night, the fear, the desperate struggle for freedom, and the cold presence of human cruelty remains with me, a reminder that real danger can sometimes be closer than we ever expect.
I never imagined that a fun weekend getaway would turn into a fight for our lives. It was supposed to be an exciting break from our busy lives, My friends and I planned a camping trip in Cedar Ridge Woods, a quiet, remote area known for its natural beauty and peace. We arrived in high spirits, setting up our tents, laughing around the campfire, and enjoying the crisp night air. The night was calm, and we talked about everything under the stars. But what started as a carefree escape soon turned into a scene of chaos and terror. Around midnight, as we were settling in, a distant sound of engines broke the silence. At first, we thought it might be other campers, but the noise grew louder and closer. Suddenly, headlights cut through the darkness, and a battered pickup truck screeched to a halt near our campsite. My heart sank as several figures emerged from the vehicle. They were rough-looking men, armed and clearly intent on something sinister. Before we could react, one of the men shouted, "Get down!" and chaos erupted. I scrambled to gather my friends, my mind racing as I tried to understand what was happening. In the blink of an eye, these local criminals had ambushed us. They moved with a calculated aggression, demanding our valuables and belongings. I remember the terror in my friend Lisa's eyes as she clutched her phone, knowing that every second counted. I tried to reason with them, my voice shaking as I pleaded for calm, but they only sneered and advanced further. One of the men pushed me roughly, sending me sprawling onto the cold, damp ground. The sound of fists and harsh shouts filled the night as we struggled to protect ourselves. I could barely hear my own thoughts over the overwhelming noise. Every instinct told me that we needed to escape before things got worse. In a moment of desperate clarity, I managed to break free from a heavy grip and urged my friends to run. We scattered in different directions, hoping to confuse our attackers. I ran through the dark woods, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I followed a faint path that promised a way out. The sound of the criminals' voices echoed behind me, mixing with the rustle of leaves and the pounding of my heart. I don't remember how long I ran. The forest seemed endless as I darted between trees and dodged low-hanging branches. At one point, I tripped over a hidden root and tumbled to the ground, scraping my hands and knees. Even in that painful moment, I knew I had to keep moving. I pushed myself up and continued, the image of my friends' terrified faces driving me on. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a narrow dirt road where a passing car slowed down. I flagged it down, my voice hoarse from shouting. The driver, startled by my appearance and frantic tone, stopped to help. I managed to explain in broken words what had happened. He immediately called the police, and soon enough, flashing lights broke through the darkness. In the aftermath, the police investigation revealed that these criminals had been operating in Cedar Ridge Woods for months, preying on unsuspecting campers. News reports later confirmed similar attacks in the area. The incident left me deeply scarred, a constant reminder that sometimes the most frightening horrors come not from ghosts or legends, but from the cruel actions of real people. Even now, every time I hear a distant engine or see a group gathered by a campfire in the woods, I remember that reckless encounter. The terror of that night, the violent ambush, the desperate flight, and the fear for my friends' lives remains with me, a warning that danger can hide in the most unexpected places.